Okay, and so without further ado, let's get started with this talk, What's New for Working with Files. My name is Mark. I'm a program manager on the user experience team in Windows. And we're going to see today how you can make your apps richer by interfacing with user content and getting the users media, music, images, and videos to come up in your app and enhance it in different ways. First, I'm going to give you a refresher of things we talked about when we introduced you to Windows 8, and the guidelines and concepts behind interacting with the user's files. So this is going to be a reminder of things that we already mentioned, but then we're going to go into the cool stuff, which is, hey, after listening to the feedback of the developer community and our users, what are the scenarios that we've added in Windows 8.1 that make your apps even better when you interact with the user's files? And finally, you've heard this morning, SkyDrive is a big part of Windows 8.1, and I want to touch a little bit on what that means to you as a developer, how can when your app will get in touch with SkyDrive, and what you can do in those cases to have a great experience and to react in the best way possible. When you come out of here, really the key message I want to give to you is it's possible with a few simple updates to your app to just have an app that works great with any kind of file, regardless of where it's located, on SkyDrive, on the local machine, on networks, on devices. And as a developer, you don't have to code against specific locations and have different behaviors for each of those. But first, let's get into the refresher part of this talk and go over some of the core concepts that we think about when we think about files. There's 4 big groups of files. The first one is app state, app data. And this one, the way to think about it is it goes away when your app gets uninstalled. So it can be your app state, but it can also be any content that users create within your app that doesn't make sense in any other app. So that doesn't make sense to export to other folders so that other apps can access it. The second group is the one we really are going to focus on today, like I mentioned, and is the user's content. If you saw that session in Windows 8, you remember that this was the local PC. In Windows 8.1, it's the local PC and SkyDrive. We think of those two together as the user content and as really indissociable. The third group is device and network, and they expand the second with additions that you can add, like external drives, network shares, anything. And then the broader one is just the web. There's different ways for your app to get to acquire web files. You could either go and download them yourself, or someone else could pass them on to you via one of the Windows contracts, like the share contract or the app-to-app picking contract, if you've used either of those. A typical example of an app that interfaces with your content is obviously the Photos app that we ship in Windows. That app provides an immersive, beautiful view of the user's pictures collection for the user to go and manage and either as a group, copying, moving, cutting files, or for each image individually to rotate, to crop, or to make some specific edits, like you saw this morning in the keynote, like effects, colors, saturation, etc. And so this app really doesn't make a ton of sense without the user content. There's really nothing to do in that app without the user content. So the way that app gets access to the system is via the capabilities and saying, hey, I want to see all of the user's content in the pictures collection. In 90% of the case, that's not going to be necessary. Many apps, we think, only need to get one file at a time to make a specific edit, do a specific kind of manipulation, and then save it back. And for those cases, we have the picker. The picker is really the most common way to access files. It's super simple to use. All you do is do a one-line call to the picker, get a file back, and do whatever edits you want on it, and then export it back with a safe picker. And like I said, for those apps that do need the broader collection, you do have the library capabilities, but those tend to be only for apps that don't make sense without all the users, access to all the users' content. And they tend to be also more complicated and complex to build because they require you to build your own views over the user's content. One thing to note is there's a third way to acquire files a bit indirectly, which is file activation. Right? Whenever a user double-clicks a file, if your app has declared that you could handle JPEGs and that file is a JPEG, the user gets the option to use your app to open that file, and you gain access to that file indirectly via that contract. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this later. So with all those scenarios of acquiring, manipulating files, I do want to talk a little bit about the principles that we had in mind when we came up with the APIs that we built for the Windows file access model. We have 2 groups of principles, user principle, developer principles. For users, I just want to call out one in particular, which is control. we do believe that users should always be in control of who has access to their files and how. And that's naturally for the user to be confident that we don't have apps that surreptitiously get access to their files to delete them or copy them and do things that they don't want with. So control and confidence is really something that we put a lot of value in, as well as usefulness. And that applies both to users and developers, because we do want you to have usable APIs. We know we haven't thought of all the scenarios that you might want to accomplish with our APIs. So we're trying to be as flexible as possible when we design our APIs so that when you go and imagine something new, it's possible to go and do it. So we do have a fairly versatile set of APIs here that are built on top of the Windows file system and Windows Indexer, which interact directly with files and keep tabs of all the files in the system. And on top of that layer, we have built the Windows Runtime APIs that give you access to metadata, thumbnails, enumerations, complex queries, and any file operations like rename, copy, cut, delete. And that's kind of where you come into play and build the great experiences over the user's files. Some key concepts that are fairly extensively documented on MSDN, so I won't spend too much time on them, but the storage item is kind of the basic level at which you access the file system, and you can use that to get properties and thumbnails or do some rename and delete operations. File and folders are specialized versions of this storage item and give you operations that are more specific to files and folders, like opening a file or enumerating a folder. And before digging into the new stuff, I want to talk a little bit about what you can do with what we shipped in Windows 8. And for that, I want to introduce you to the Hilo app that some of you may know, which has been built by the Codeplex, the Patterns and Practices team, and posted on Codeplex. And that app is a browser over the user's pictures collection that has a unique take on pictures that shows a timeline view and uses our APIs to achieve that. So I downloaded that app and made a few edits of my own, and I want to show you a little bit what you can do. So as you see here, I have all my pictures library arranged by month. It follows all the Windows 8 guidelines. It has semantic zoom. Can dig back into any month that I want. So I'm in March now, and I can dig in, and I'm using a flip view here to navigate between the different photos that I have. And for each of them, I can open my app bar, and I have rotate and crop services. So all of this built with the Windows 8 APIs that we shipped a year ago. So let's get into the interesting stuff now, which is what can we do with this app, Hilo.js, in Windows 8.1 that will add value for users? Well, first, I'm going to go over some basic functionality that we've added for file access in general, and then, like I said, we're going to talk about SkyDrive a little bit more in particular. For the general functionality, we've identified 3 scenarios based on feedback on forums, blogs, on our users' comments, and we've tried to identify the 3 key scenarios that would add the most value in Windows 8.1. The first is improving navigation between files during file activation with what we call neighboring files query. And that is for the scenario I just mentioned where you double-click on a file. You want to be able to navigate back and forth between the files that were around that file you just double-clicked. So we focus on that scenario to try and make it great in Windows 8.1. A second one is content discovery. In Windows 8, if your app can get the library capabilities that I mentioned, where you get access to all of the user's photo collection, but you can't really manage that collection from your app. The user has to go and do that management task somewhere else. So in Windows 8.1, we focused in enabling end-to-end scenarios directly within your app of being able to discover new content and manage that directly from your app. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about some new methods that we've created to improve your coding efficiency and make just your life easier in general without necessarily targeting a specific end-to-end scenario and just looking at common tasks that people did and make those tasks a bit faster to accomplish. So first, improving navigation between files. This will revolve around the file-activated event arguments neighboring files query object. And the scenario typically here is I'm navigating a view. It could be a search view. It could be a file explorer view. I'm seeing a bunch of files. double-click one of the files, and my favorite app opens that particular file that I just double-clicked. In Windows 8, that's where it stops. In Windows 8.1, using the neighboring files query, you can swipe left, swipe right, and get access to all the files around that. It's really simple to use. It's just a new argument over the event details, and it's just a query. If you're familiar with the Windows 8 file APIs, we have this object called the storage file query result, which is basically a collection of files that match a certain criterion. This is one of those. So this interface is exactly the same that exists today. So if you pass it to an existing view that your app has today of files, that view will be able to talk to that object and display all the files inside of it. So really, there's no additional work to create a view with that object. All you have to do is retrieve it and then pass it to your existing view. So a really cool way to improve how your user navigates files within your app. Another one is content discovery that I just mentioned. So in this particular case, what you want to do is imagining you're a music app and you want to look at all of your users' music library. But let's imagine all of that collection is actually stored on an external drive. So when you start up your app, you're going to see an empty collection because the user hasn't yet added this content from the external drive to their collection. So what we're going to do here is give you the option to use a new object called the storage library. And the storage library is going to give you the methods you need to go and directly manage that collection. One typically that I want to call out is adding a folder. So what your app would do is use this storage library object to call the picker. I don't know if you've used the folder picker before, but it's basically a view of all the users' hard drive where they can navigate and select a folder. And once they've selected that folder, it gets added to the library and then passed back to your app. The advantage of this is you get all the query abilities that you get from libraries. So you can do advanced filtering, query by album, genre, artist, and any other app that has the music library capability will also see the same collection. So what that means is for users, within your app, they've gone and added new content to their collection, and they've done that centrally, which means that they don't have to go and do it again in any other app that looks at their music. And your app didn't have to send them to a kind of third page for managing the library. They could do all of this directly from your app. This is, again, one of the simplest APIs to use. All you do is call this request add folder async API. The picker opens and essentially takes care of everything. So you don't even have to check for errors or anything that could happen if the folder that the user selected could not be added to the library, for example. That is handled directly by the picker. So the picker will show the error in line and not return. So really all you have to do is call this, and then if you're using content change notifications, you will get one of those when they add something to the library. And so automatically your UI will refresh and show the new folder. So really super easy to take advantage of this without a ton of new code. Finally, I want to call out 3 new helpers that we've added to our API namespace. Get parent folder async is a good one if you're an app that has access to the pictures to a collection of the user's files, and you want to do a save side-by-side scenario. So I opened, for example, one of my pictures. I edited it, but you don't want to save back over the original. You want to save a copy. What you would do is simply get the parent folder of that original and save a new file under that folder, and now you have side-by-side copy in just a few lines of code. EasyQual is another one of those common scenarios that we try to make better in Windows 8.1, where now you can compare 2 files, make sure they're different, make sure or make sure they're the same if you want to perform some operations that require identity to be checked. And the last one is really cool if you're coding in C#. It's a try version of the getItemAsync API. So that getItemAsync API exists in Windows 8, but it returns a lot of errors potentially from the file system if for a reason X or Y the file couldn't be retrieved, like it was deleted, and so now you get a file not found error or an access denied error. This will just return null in those cases. So all you have to do is check for null, and you know that if the result that's returned is null, something failed, but you don't have to individually handle all those different exceptions. So those aren't necessarily catering to one specific end-to-end scenario, but I thought I'd call them out because they're definitely helping if you want to write less code. Now what I would like to do is go back to the Hilo.js app and look at those first two scenarios I brought up, neighboring files query and the add to library command, and add them. So we're going to make sure my app, if I double-click on a file, can open that file and all the neighboring files. And we're going to make sure that within my app, I can go and add new photos to my photo collection. OK. So we're going to go into Visual Studio here. And this is my default file. I'm going to add a piece of code for activation. What it does here is simply look at the activation kind, and if it's a file activation, it will get the neighboring files query and pass it on in an options object to my view. And my view really is the existing view that I have today, so there's nothing completely new here to do. All I have to do is make sure that I'm getting that data and passing it to the view. So now if I go to my desktop and go in this selection folder, the desktop is kind of off limits for my app. All I know about is the user's pictures library, so those files I don't have access to. But if the user goes and explicitly says that they want to open this file with my app, then my app gets activated, sees that file. In Windows 8, again, it stops here. If I want to get to the next file, I have to go back to Explorer and get that file. Not anymore. Now I can just iterate through the view, and all the files within that view are accessible to my app. So that's pretty cool, and you'll see that in the Inbox Photos app, which now takes advantage of that capability. Great reason to add file activation if you don't have it yet. The next thing I want to do is, if you go into this app, you see we have a nice app bar here. I'm going to add a button to that app bar to add more locations to my library. So for that, I go in my app bar file. I add the button in my app bar. And the click handler for this is going to be really simple. All it does really is gets the library object and calls request at folder async. Like I said, no error handling necessary. And all the code that I already have today to manage my view is going to be used here. So let's see what this looks like. Go in here, click Add Pictures. I can check here that my vacation folder on my SkyDrive contains all the photos I want to add. Say add this folder, and there's a two-step verification for folder access, as you know. And if I click OK, my app sees that the new content got added through the contents changed event, and now I have more photos that come from my SkyDrive. And my app kind of aggregates all those photos together into this timeline view. So my app doesn't care about what's local, what's on SkyDrive. All it does is it looks at the timeline and shows all those files together. Now that gives me a great segue into the final section of this talk, which is, hey, what does SkyDrive do for me as a developer now that it's baked into the OS? So you've heard this morning, SkyDrive is built into Windows, and that's definitely the case. What it means is users can go and manage their files and folders directly on SkyDrive as in any other place on their hard drive. And they get for free all the cool SkyDrive sync functionality that we have, and they can access their files both online and offline. To give you a few examples of what that means, you now have this SkyDrive app on your start screen. It's the same app you had in Windows 8, but completely updated to have a whole host of new features. Like I said, full sync, online, offline management, access your local files and SkyDrive files for copying and moving across SkyDrive and the local computer. And also integration with all the OS features like the photo viewer and editor. So you can go within the SkyDrive app and do all those cool editing operations that we showed this morning at the keynote. A second place where SkyDrive appears and is very prominent is the picker. In the picker, if you remember, we have a series of system scopes at the top. Those scopes have been kind of revamped, and now we have 3 key locations: SkyDrive, this PC, and network. And we think those 3 places are the places that users care about and are going to want to go and pick files from. And SkyDrive is key among those, and that gives you access to all the files that you have on SkyDrive. This is mirrored on the desktop with also 3 folders in your navigation pane: SkyDrive, this PC, and the network. So you have this symmetry of locations across all the system at every level. As a developer as well, you will be able to see if a file is from the local PC or SkyDrive. We'll give you that directly from our APIs. But really, we don't think you're going to need that very often. You've seen the Hilo.js app. It just shows everything in a timeline view. There are lots of cases like this where location doesn't really matter. All that matters is seeing all my files. And so starting from that point of view, what we said was, really, developers shouldn't have to care if something is on SkyDrive or on the local machine. They should be able to do that if they want to, but they shouldn't have to. And so really, what we've said is SkyDrive files are just files. On the system, we have a storage file object, and that's an abstraction that applies to all files regardless of where they come from. Typically in Windows 8, if you were using the picker and to acquire some files, your user could go in the picker and select the Bing app and select a file, an image from the Bing app. That image typically would come from the Bing servers. It wouldn't be local. But all your app would get back is a storage file. And that file would, behind the scenes, be downloaded by the OS, and you wouldn't really be aware of that. We've expanded that notion to SkyDrive files as well, where some SkyDrive files are going to be cached locally, some aren't. And really, you shouldn't care about that. When you access the file, the system is going to do what it needs to do in the background and get all the data available to you. One thing I do want to spend a little more time on is this notion of files that are not cached locally. We call those placeholder files. And those files are proxies that represent things that are on SkyDrive, but that aren't for which we don't have a local copy. They're a completely new concept in Windows 8.1. At the lowest level in the file system, they exist and represent a file, look exactly like a file. We have metadata, we have thumbnails, so we can show those even though the contents of the file aren't available, and we can show those both online and offline. So to a user and a developer, they really look the same. And all we do is we have some mechanisms in the background that ensure that those files behave the same as regular files. We'll talk about that a little bit. One thing to note is that because of these placeholder files, we can show you a full view of all your files regardless of network connectivity. So even if I go offline, I can go and look at my picker, and the picker is going to tell me, hey, you're offline, but it's still going to show me all my files. Simply where it's going to show me a representation of them, like for images, pictures, thumbnails. So I know I can recognize that content. I know it's mine. It's all there. It's not coming and going as I go online and offline. And I can visually differentiate the ones that are available immediately, which have the full opacity, and the ones that aren't, which are a bit grayed out. We also have typography to differentiate those items if you're in a different view mode. And we use the words available online, available offline, or online only. And online only really means, hey, you can open this if you go back online. Now, what that means for your app is two things, two kind of call to actions. One, check for availability. We've tried to make it very simple for you to determine at any given time if a file is available. And that way you can create this similar view that we've seen in the picker where you display, you can visually differentiate things that are available and not available. Now, there's a catch, which is that, like I said, many operations can be performed on placeholder files and offline files alike. And so you don't want to blanket turn off everything for a file that's offline. You kind of want to think a little bit about what can I do with this file? And most of the time, the only thing you can't do is edit it or change things because the contents of the file aren't there. But you can definitely represent it with thumbnails, which leads me to my second point, use thumbnails. Thumbnails are a great way to show things without necessarily acquiring them from where they actually live. And it's going to, if you use thumbnails, it's going to improve the perf of your app because we're going to be able to optimize how we get the visuals. And it's going to improve your behavior when the user doesn't have network connectivity. So let's dig a little bit into availability. We've created a new property called isAvailable. And that property is really awesome. It's fast to check, so you can really look at it without thinking without worrying about perf. You can data bind it to a view. You can do a ton of stuff with it. And it applies to any file. So again, you could even check is available for a local file. It's always going to return true because that file is always available. It's cached locally. Now, where it gets interesting is if you're looking at network files or SkyDrive files, and the user is offline or on a metered network, then that property might return false. What's really cool is the metered network case, where if you didn't have that property, you would have to check the current connectivity state. You would have to check if the user is okay with you downloading things over a metered connection because they might be paying for it. We're doing all of that for you. We're doing all those checks for you. All you have to do is look at that property, and if the user said, hey, don't download any of my content over metered connections, we're going to deny access at that point. One thing to note is that does not give you an excuse to stop handling errors. This property is a great helper to create a view that differentiates items, but as every other property on files, that property doesn't update dynamically. So if the network goes out, what happens is this stays at the old value. What you get is you get a content change notification that you then have to use to requery the file and check the new status. So if for some reason you went and tried to access a file that in the meantime became offline, you still have to handle those errors of, hey, something went offline. And we've provided those errors so that it's very easy for you to recognize those cases. In the kind of common scenario, this property is super easy to use. You just check if it's false or true. And in one case, you just treat it as a normal file, like you would treat any local file. And if it returns false, then you can visually differentiate it and apply some treatment. Well, we have some recommendations around how to behave when files are offline. One thing is opacity. You've seen it in the picker. 40% opacity is what we use here. So kind of graying out a file that's not available is a good way to do that. Again, definitely a good thing to do if your app has a lot of features around files is make two lists. One list of things that will still work when you're offline because it's just a rename or a delete, and those we can totally perform on placeholder files. Those operations will succeed. Or if you have edit or changes, then those cannot be performed offline. And for those that cannot be performed offline, you can show the corresponding buttons and UI as disabled and provide the appropriate messaging to the user and say, hey, you're offline right now. You cannot use that feature. One more thing to note is progress. In Windows 8, most of the files you were working with were local. So what happened was you would call an async method, and that method would return pretty fast because all the data was immediately available. So we know that many apps do not show progress during async calls on files. That needs to change because when you're working with SkyDrive files, we can go to the cloud and download the full file, so that can take a while. And we do want your app to look responsive, to show that it's doing something, to show that there's progress happening. So showing indeterminate progress there definitely helps. And if you think that your users might want to access big files like music, like video, providing cancellation is an added bonus as well, because then the user can change their mind, go cancel, and we don't finish the download. We will go and cancel the download, and we'll stop using resources at that point. Another thing we talked about a little bit was thumbnails. So thumbnails kind of fall into this category of things that really help manage performance and manage resource consumption. Placeholders are definitely a big step in that direction, where placeholders say that we only download metadata about the file. We don't go and download lots of stuff over the wire for all your files on SkyDrive. Thumbnails are another piece of that puzzle, where we observe that increasingly pictures are in the several megabytes because of how cameras now, the quality of cameras. And we definitely don't want to download 10 megabytes worth of bits just to show an image full screen. Because if you think about it, full screen is not 16 megapixels. Full screen is 1920 by 1080. And really, in some way, that is a thumbnail. So we've added support for very large thumbnails in the system. And we believe that in most cases, it's going to be possible to provide full consumption experiences, so anything that doesn't require edit, using only thumbnails. And so we've created this new API, get scaled image as thumbnail async, which will accept an arbitrary size. So you can just pass it any size of thumbnails you want, 1920 by 1080, 1600, and we're going to do our best to meet that request. And if we cannot meet that request using the different levels of caches we have, like the local cache, the embedded thumbnails, the cloud cache, we will fall back to the actual file. So what happens is you can blindly call this and trust us to just do all the fallbacks on your behalf, so you don't have to do them in your app. So anytime you want to display an image for consumption for viewing only, just get a thumbnail. And that will really ensure that your app gets a visual as fast as possible with the system, because we can return thumbnails up to 1600 pixels. So if what you need is under 1600 pixels, we will actually go to a cache and return it immediately without downloading anything. That API follows the same semantics that we've already used in all the thumbnail APIs that we shipped in Windows 8. So you pass it a thumbnail mode, which determines the aspect ratio of the thumbnail and what it looks like. You pass it a size, again, unbounded, as big as you want. And you pass it a few options. And then it returns either the thumbnail that you requested, or if nothing is found in the cache and you're offline and the file isn't cached and really there's nothing to return, it returns null. So you still have to handle this null case. So now I'm going to go back to the Hilo.js app and make sure that it represents files on SkyDrive well and is resilient to the offline states, and that it uses thumbnails to improve performance. So let's go back to the demo. Here I'm going to go into my picture.js, which is a wrapper around the storage files. And I'm going to add a few new properties here. One is the preview. So this is going to be my preview thumbnail, which I'm going to use instead of actually downloading files. And this is opacity and offline state, which I base off of the isAvailable property. And then later on, I'm going to go and actually get the preview thumbnail. And so here I do a little bit of smart stuff where I look at the size of the screen, and depending on the size of the screen, I'm going to request a different size of thumbnail in order to make sure that I only get what I need, which is something that I can display in my flip view. Then I'm going to go into my details view, which is the kind of one-up view. And instead of binding to the image source, I'm going to bind to the image preview. So now, nothing in my app now accesses the actual image unless I have to go and crop or rotate, which are the edit operations. Here in my HTML, I'm going to add a little bit of text that says, hey, this file is available online only. And I'm going to bind that to the offline state. And because I want to look like the picker, I'm going to add a little bit of code to change the opacity of objects that aren't available. OK. So let's look at what this looks like here with our app. So I go back here, and I still have all my stuff on SkyDrive and local. But this time, if I go offline and turn off Wi-Fi, my app gets a notification, hey, something changed, something went offline, and refreshes. And when it comes back, I do have kind of files that are styled differently, some that are offline, some that are online. And this is where you can see the power of showing the entire collection by date. Is I really don't have to care about whether something is on SkyDrive or not. All I have to care about is it available or not? And this availability can be communicated in any view that I would have created. Another great advantage of what we just talked, which is using thumbnails, is that this thing here is available online only. But if I tap on it, I can still get a visual, because I have the big thumbnails that are cached. So really, my user can still do a ton of stuff with that, even when they're offline. So I'm providing the maximum value. And I've been smart where I've said that in my app bar, any edit operation like rotate or crop is now disabled, because I'm offline and this file is not available. Cool. So to summarize, and we've talked about the basics of file access, what to do with files, and we've said, hey, the picker is really a great 90% scenario tool that you can call for cheap, and it gives you files one by one if all you're doing is interacting with files as a one-off. We've talked about new interactions with files, like file activation and navigating files back and forth. Again, a great time to add that to your app if you don't have it in Windows 8. And we've talked about content discovery via the libraries. We've also looked at a few quick ways, availability and thumbnails, to optimize your apps for online, offline states and connectivity. And I'd encourage you to kind of go and do those quick updates. Like you've seen, it's really not a lot of code. We've tried to boil it down to the essentials and take care of all the background logic. Few resources to definitely check out. One is The Story of the State. It's the equivalent of this talk that really dives deep into using files to maintain your app state and how you can roam that. Very interesting by Craig Brockschmidt, and that will be on the Channel 9 website very soon. And then those are a few links to MSDN, to existing documentation. We have exhaustive documentation of all those APIs that I mentioned in the first half from Windows 8. And you can go and look them up and see what you can do with those. We definitely have quite a bit of time for Q&A, so feel free to ask any questions. And yeah, I know you had one, so you go first.
What of this, if any, is available for desktop apps?
So most of this is available to desktop apps. Not in the same shape, though. So the code snippets I've shown don't apply to desktop apps, especially if you don't use the Windows Runtime APIs. But we have properties that tell you if a file is available online or offline, so you can go and look at those properties. One thing to note is if your desktop app is using shell APIs, actually a lot of the abstraction I've mentioned exists via the shell APIs. So if you bind to a stream with the shell APIs, that stream is transparently going to be downloaded from SkyDrive when appropriate. So really, you won't have to worry about whether the file is online or offline. All you have to do is bind to the stream and start your access. Got one?
So you said any file you basically open and grab the full file, and it'll automatically catch that, and it'll download that to be like a local file?
Yeah, correct. So this is a mechanism that we use that's based on user activity. We say if a user has gone and opened a file via your app or via any app on the system, it likely means that they want to go back to it later. So we make it available offline at that point. One thing to note, though, is that as an app, you shouldn't really rely on that because at any time the user can go into the SkyDrive app and say, hey, stop making this available offline, and the file's contents are going to disappear. So it's really entirely in the user's hand what's offline and what's not.
One more. So is this model extensible if I want to have a data provider that's not SkyDrive? Is that extensible?
So in Windows 8.1, other providers, or other thing providers, will continue to work as in Windows 8. So you can go and download the Dropbox executable or and install their sync engine and have their sync. But only SkyDrive has the kind of features that I just described. Anything else? One more.
Is the SkyDrive API backend open? So can I tap into this by protocol?
So I'm going to answer. You tell me if this is not the answer you were expecting. There is still what we call the Live Connect SkyDrive APIs, so you can talk directly to the SkyDrive service. I know some apps do that already, so this is still available. Those are completely independent of Windows Runtime, though, so they will not. You will continue to use them as you use them today. Cool. Thanks, everyone. And I'll be around, so feel free to just come and ask me questions if you want.